We'd been planning this road trip for years, each of us desperate to revisit the memories of late-night drives and too much coffee, just like in college. Now, with work and adult lives pulling us in different directions, this was our last shot at that pure, reckless freedom we used to take for granted. There were 5 of us: me, Chris, Jade, Tom, and Eva. And for once, everything seemed to align perfectly. We had a week off, a route mapped out, and an old van packed to the roof with snacks, blankets, and gas station souvenirs. Our first stop was a small town diner just off the main road, miles away from anything familiar. It was one of those rundown places you only find if you're either terribly lost or desperately hungry. We piled out of the van, stretching and laughing at our mutual exhaustion from the early start. Inside, the place was quiet, almost deserted except for an elderly couple near the back. A waitress, barely older than us, led us to a booth by the window. "Feels like something out of a movie," Tom muttered, eyes flicking around the room with an exaggerated look of wonder. He always had that flair for the dramatic, a trait that made him both the funniest and most annoying in our group. "Maybe it is a movie," Jade said with a wink, sliding into the booth. "One where the characters make questionable decisions at every turn." "Like eating here?" Chris asked, inspecting a laminated menu that looked older than we were. We laughed, and for a moment, it felt like old times. The waitress took our orders, and we settled into easy conversation, catching up on each other's lives and sharing stories from work. Eva, who'd brought her camera, snapped a few shots of us, saying they'd be good before pictures. But as our laughter filled the small diner, I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. Across the room, a man sat alone, his gaze steady and unblinking as he watched us. He was probably in his 40s, with thinning hair and deep lines etched into his face. His eyes, though, they seemed far too sharp, too familiar. I caught his eye for a second, and he looked away quickly, hiding his face behind a newspaper. Still, something about him felt off, like a memory at the back of my mind that I couldn't quite grasp. I shook it off, figuring he was probably just a local, curious about the loud group of strangers in his town. When our food arrived, we dug in, our earlier discomfort feeding into the comfort of shared meals and road trip banter. Tom and Eva started one of their classic debates, and we quickly got drawn into it, arguing over the best horror movies to watch on the road. The strange man across the room was forgotten, at least until we were back on the road. The drive to our motel took longer than expected. By the time we pulled into the gravel parking lot, the sun had dipped below the horizon and shadows stretched across the empty road. The motel was the typical roadside type, cheap, anonymous, the kind of place people stay when they don't want to be remembered. We checked in with a bored receptionist who barely looked up from her book as she handed us 2 sets of keys. The night air felt oddly heavy as we unloaded our bags. It was silent, not a single cricket or breeze to break the stillness. Inside our room, we collapsed onto the beds, exhausted but still buzzing with the day's energy. But sleep didn't come easily. Around midnight, I heard the faintest sound outside, soft footsteps on gravel, pacing back and forth outside the door. I held my breath, listening. The steps stopped, then started again, just outside our room. I glanced at Chris, who was snoring, completely oblivious. I thought about waking him, but the sound faded, and I convinced myself it was just someone from the neighboring rooms. Morning came too soon, but over breakfast in the motel lobby, I brought it up to the others, laughing it off, though my voice felt tight. Probably some poor soul couldn't sleep and decided to take a midnight stroll, Jade suggested, pouring herself a cup of coffee. Or maybe, Eva added with a grin, it's the guy from the diner. What if he's following us? Tom made a spooky face, leaning in close. The mystery man strikes again, he intoned, waggling his fingers in an exaggerated gesture. Everyone laughed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe Eva was onto something. As we packed up to leave, I noticed something odd. Someone had left a small slip of paper tucked under the windshield wiper of the van. I pulled it out, expecting a note from the motel about checkout, but my heart skipped a beat when I saw what was written. "See you soon," it read, scrawled in messy, looping letters. "Who leaves notes like that?" Chris asked, brow furrowing as he looked over my shoulder. "It's probably a prank," Jade said, trying to sound reassuring, but her voice wavered just enough to betray her unease. We brushed it off, shoving the note in the glove compartment and telling ourselves it was nothing. But as we drove down the long, winding road, every passing car felt like a threat, and every stranger's gaze felt a bit too intense. By the time we reached the next town, the laughter and lightheartedness of the morning had been replaced by a tense, uneasy silence. None of us wanted to say it, but I could feel it, something wasn't right. And as we checked into the next motel that evening, the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. We'd been on the road for hours, the laughter and joking starting to fade as the sun reached its peak overhead. The van had fallen into an easy silence, our thoughts drifting as we watched the countryside roll by. We hadn't seen another town or even a single car in miles when the gas light flickered on and Chris groaned. "Seriously? Didn't we just fill up?" he muttered, gripping the steering wheel. "Not since that diner," Jay pointed out. "You're the one who wanted to see how far we could get without stopping." "Relax," Eva chimed in, scrolling through her phone's map. "There's a gas station up ahead. Shouldn't be more than 5 minutes." True to her word, the station appeared on the horizon a few minutes later, a small, dusty place that looked like it had been pulled straight from an old horror flick. The sign above it flickered weakly, one of the letters hanging by a single bolt. A lone pump sat beneath a weathered awning, and the lot was empty except for an old sedan parked near the building's entrance. "Lovely," Tom muttered, raising an eyebrow. "Why do all these places look like they were abandoned 50 years ago?" "Adds to the charm," I joked, trying to lighten the mood, but the unease I'd felt at the diner had settled back into my stomach. Something about the silence around us felt almost unnatural. We parked next to the pump, and as Chris got out to fill the tank, the rest of us climbed out to stretch. Jade wandered toward the edge of the lot, aiming her phone at the scenery, and Eva followed, snapping pictures of the desolate landscape. Tom leaned against the van, tapping out some rhythm with his fingers. That's when I saw him. Standing just outside the restroom, not 15 feet away, was the same man from the diner. He stood motionless, one hand resting against the wall, eyes fixed directly on me. His gaze was unnervingly intense, and the vague familiarity of his face gnawed at me, like trying to remember the ending to a dream that faded the moment you woke up. A chill ran down my spine. I nudged Tom, whispering, "Look over by the restroom." "It's him." Tom glanced over, his eyes widening slightly before he broke into a grin. Well, it looks like we've got a fan." "You think he's following us?" "Not funny," I muttered, shoving my hands into my pockets. I wanted to brush it off, too, pretend it was just some weird coincidence. But something about the way the man stared, it was like he knew me. "Maybe he's the silent type," Jade said, strolling over and glancing at the man. She waved at him, a mischievous grin on her face. He didn't wave back, he didn't even blink. Just kept staring. "He's definitely our stalker," Eva laughed, snapping a picture of him with her camera. "Our own little ghost story." "Let's get back in the van," I said, my voice coming out sharper than I meant. "This place is giving me the creeps." Tom scoffed, "Geez, someone's on edge." But I wasn't joking. I could feel the man's eyes on us as we piled back into the van, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't just staring at us, he was watching me, like he recognized me from some forgotten part of my past. As we pulled out of the gas station, I glanced in the rearview mirror. He was still there, standing by the restroom, his face fading into the distance, but his gaze lingering in my mind. I tried to shake it off, laughing with the others as they joked about our stalker, but the feeling stayed, a weight that settled in my chest as the miles ticked by. The road stretched ahead, long and empty, and after a few minutes of silence, Tom turned on the radio, scrolling through stations until he found an old rock song we all knew. We sang along, our voices filling the van as the unease began to fade. But halfway through the chorus, the song abruptly cut out, replaced by static. Chris frowned, reaching over to adjust the dial, but the radio seemed to have a mind of its own, jumping between stations in quick, random bursts of sound, an old country song, an ominous newscast, a children's lullaby. "Guess the radio's haunted, too," Tom joked, though he looked as unsettled as I felt. We finally managed to get it back to the rock station, but the atmosphere had changed. The landscape around us felt more desolate, the air thick with silence. Even the trees looked strange, their branches twisted and gnarled as if they were reaching toward us. "Hey, Eva, didn't you say there was a turn coming up?" Chris asked, squinting at the road ahead. "I feel like we should have hit it by now." Eva glanced at her phone, frowning. "It says we're still on track, but I could have sworn we passed this spot already." I looked around, a chill crawling up my spine. I hadn't noticed it before, but the scenery did look oddly familiar, as if we were driving in circles. The GPS showed a straight line, but the road felt like it was looping back on itself, the same trees, the same bends, over and over again. "Maybe we should stop and check the map," I suggested, trying to keep the nervousness out of my voice. But Chris just shook his head, gripping the wheel tighter. "Nah, we're fine. We just need to keep going." The van fell silent again, and I found myself drifting back to high school memories, faces and places flashing through my mind as I tried to place the man from the diner. Had he been a teacher? A friend's parent? I couldn't pin it down, but there was something familiar about him, something tied to a time I hadn't thought about in years. Suddenly, the radio cut out again, this time replaced by a faint, crackling voice. It was hard to make out, but the words sent a shiver down my spine. "Find you, always watching." We exchanged uneasy glances, and Chris quickly turned the volume down, forcing a laugh. Probably just a weird signal. These old radios pick up all sorts of random frequencies. "Yeah, totally," Jade agreed, but I could see her hand shaking as she fiddled with her phone. We all felt it, that creeping, gnawing feeling that something was terribly, inexplicably wrong. A few minutes later, we finally hit the turn, but instead of relief, a strange heaviness settled over us. The road ahead was narrower, the trees thicker, closing in around us. We drove in tense silence, every shadow and sound amplified by the growing unease. It was around that time I remembered something. A fleeting image of a face from high school, someone who'd lingered at the edges of my friend group. I couldn't remember his name, but I recalled his face in flashes, a quiet guy, always on the outskirts of conversations, watching but never joining in. What had happened to him? The memory was frustratingly vague, like trying to recall a dream, but I couldn't shake the image of his eyes, watching us from across the room, always there but never acknowledged. I shivered, rubbing my arms as if to shake off the memories. The van felt colder now, the air thick and stale. Even with everyone else around me, I'd never felt so isolated. The silence in the van became deafening, and I realized we hadn't spoken in nearly 10 minutes. It was as if something had settled over us, a shared understanding that none of us dared to voice. We were all thinking it, whatever was happening, it wasn't normal. We weren't just lost on a road trip. We were being followed. And deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd seen that man's face before. Not just in high school, but in my nightmares, lurking in the corners of my memories, always watching. The overlook was a stunning place to stop, with rolling hills stretching out to the horizon, painted in shades of orange and gold by the setting sun. We pulled into the lot, laughing and unloading our phones and cameras, ready to capture the beauty of this quiet, empty place. The breeze was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and cold earth. For the first time all day, the tension lifted just a little, and I could almost pretend everything was normal. We gathered at the edge, phones held high as we tried to capture the scenery. I managed to snap a few group photos, everyone's arms slung over each other's shoulders, laughing, eyes wide with that adventurous glint we had since high school. But as I reviewed the photos, flipping through them, a shiver ran down my spine. In the background, near the tree line, there was a figure. Distant but unmistakably familiar. It was the man from the diner, from the gas station, standing stock still and watching us. "Guys," I managed to choke out, holding up my phone to show them the picture. My hands felt clammy, and a strange sort of static filled my head, like a warning I couldn't understand. "He's here. Again." "What?" Tom's voice was tinged with irritation, maybe even fear. He leaned closer, his brow furrowing as he squinted at the screen. "Oh, come on. That's probably just some other hiker. Who would hike all the way up here and not even say a word?" Jade snapped, crossing her arms. Her voice sounded defensive, covering a flicker of fear. "This isn't normal. No one just appears at every stop, staring at us." Eva grabbed the phone, looking between the screen and the horizon. "Where is he now?" We all turned, scanning the overlook and the darkening tree line. But he was gone, not a trace of him left in sight. My heart thundered in my chest, and a wave of guilt washed over me, irrational but intense, as if I'd done something wrong, something I couldn't quite remember. I was racking my brain, feeling like I was missing something just out of reach, something I should have recalled. But the harder I tried to remember, the more those images slipped through my fingers, like sand in a storm. Chris forced a laugh, his voice louder than usual, the edge of anxiety unmistakable. "Look, we're all just freaked out. It's probably some local we keep running into by chance. Small towns, right? Let's just forget it and keep going." I nodded along, trying to shake the tension from my shoulders, but I couldn't let go of the feeling that there was more to this. Something beyond coincidence, something that felt almost personal. "Are you guys really this paranoid?" Tom sneered, rubbing his temples. "We're acting like a bunch of scared kids again, jumping at shadows." I wanted to agree, but memories started resurfacing. Snippets of high school, faces I hadn't thought of in years, blending together like ghostly figures hovering just beyond my reach. There were parties, laughter, and arguments. A boy's face floated up from my memory, vaguely familiar, quiet, always on the outside of our friend group. He had a certain sadness to him, a look of someone carrying a burden no one else wanted to see. "Hey, did any of you know someone named Ben?" The name rolled off my tongue, unsteady, like I was pulling it from some hidden place in my mind. Jade glanced at me, raising an eyebrow. Ben? Not really. Why? But Eva's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of recognition crossing her face before she quickly looked away, as though she was trying to forget something unpleasant. I think I remember him. He was that quiet guy, always kind of lurking around. Yeah, always kind of, watching, I murmured, feeling a deep pang of guilt tighten around my chest. Memories started to crystallize. He'd been one of those kids everyone ignored, quiet and strange, never fitting in. And we hadn't exactly gone out of our way to make him feel included. There had been jokes, I remembered, things I'd never really considered back then. Are you serious? Tom scoffed. You think our stalker is some random kid from high school? Give me a break. Maybe you don't remember, but he definitely knew us. Eva's voice was sharp, her face pale. There was that thing, junior year. We called him Creeper Ben. He was always just there, hanging around, following us from the parking lot to class. I mean, it was creepy, wasn't it? As we argued, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the overlook. The air felt colder, and a prickle crawled up my spine, like we were being watched even now. But when I looked around, there was no one. Nothing but trees and that endless stretch of road. Come on, let's just go, Chris muttered, shoving his hands into his pockets. There's no point in staying here. We piled back into the van, the mood now brittle, each of us casting nervous glances out the windows. Tension hummed in the van, our earlier lightheartedness replaced by a simmering unease. Even the small talk felt forced, stilted, each of us retreating into our thoughts, trying to make sense of what was happening. As the darkness thickened, strange things started happening again. The radio flickered on and off, the dials shifting without anyone touching them, switching through static-filled channels, snippets of garbled voices crackling through the speakers. And each time it landed on a clear station, there were eerie phrases, things that sounded like words but weren't quite right, fragments that felt pointed, like someone was speaking directly to us. Always watching, can't hide, you know what you did. I glanced at the others, their faces lit by the eerie glow of the dashboard. No one said a word, each of them staring straight ahead, faces tense and pale. Even Tom, usually the skeptic, was gripping his seat, his jaw clenched. And then we missed a turn. The GPS showed a straight line, but the road in front of us had changed, winding back into a dense, unfamiliar forest. We tried to correct, rerouting on the map, but every attempt seemed to lead us deeper into the woods, like the road itself was shifting to keep us trapped. My mind kept drifting back to high school, to memories I buried. There were moments, small, seemingly harmless incidents I hadn't thought of in years. The way we'd all laughed at Ben, the times we'd made him the butt of a joke. It had seemed innocent enough then, a typical high school cruelty, but now the memories felt different, tinged with a bitterness I couldn't ignore. Do you think, Jade's voice was barely a whisper, that this has something to do with Ben? Like, maybe he's trying to mess with us? Don't be ridiculous, Tom snapped, though his voice wavered. This is all just a coincidence. We're just freaked out, But he didn't get to finish. There was a loud bang from somewhere outside, the sound echoing through the van like a gunshot. We froze, each of us holding our breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Then another bang, closer this time, like something was pounding on the side of the van. We stared at each other, fear in our eyes, and I knew we were all thinking the same thing. There was no way this was random. Something was following us, something that didn't want us to forget. And as I looked around, trying to convince myself it was all in my head, a memory resurfaced, clearer than ever. The last time I'd seen Ben was senior year, the day he disappeared from school. There had been whispers, rumors that he transferred or dropped out, but no one really knew. I remembered him standing at the edge of the cafeteria, watching us, a strange, haunted look in his eyes. It was the same look he had at the diner, at the gas station, here at the Overlook. It hit me like a punch to the gut. The man watching us was Ben. Or at least, someone who looked like him. Older, grimmer, his face hardened by years we hadn't been around to see. Another bang echoed through the van, and I realized with a jolt of horror that we were no longer alone. Shadows moved in the trees, figures flickering in the darkness, shapes that looked almost human but not quite right. And through the windshield, at the edge of the headlight's glow, was Ben, his face blank, eyes fixed on us. We scrambled to start the engine, each of us in a frenzied panic, our voices overlapping in shouts and cries as Chris fumbled with the keys. But as the van roared to life and we sped away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were only driving deeper into his territory, like no matter how fast we drove, he'd always be one step ahead, waiting for us just around the next bend. The motel was a faded relic of a time long gone, its neon sign flickering and buzzing in the cool morning air as I tossed and turned. I could hear the wind rattling the loose windows, a faint, constant creak in the walls, like a heartbeat. No one else was sleeping well either. I could hear hushed whispers from the others' rooms, footsteps creaking down the hallway, punctuated by the occasional rustling of bed sheets. My mind was spinning, locked onto the nightmarish pattern that had unfolded over the past 2 days, replaying every unnerving encounter, every flash of the stranger's face. Then, it hit me. That face wasn't just vaguely familiar. It was familiar. A wave of shame and unease washed over me as I thought of that quiet boy from high school, Ben. We had laughed at him, called him names, made him the punchline of our jokes. He'd been weird, always lurking on the edges of our group, watching us with a mixture of longing and resentment. It was harmless, or so we thought back then. Now, as I lay there in the silent motel room, my heart pounding, I wondered if he ever forgiven us, or if he had decided to make us remember. By the time the sun crept up, filling the room with a thin, pale light, I had that sickening certainty gnawing at me. I knew without a doubt that the man we kept seeing was Ben, older, angrier, and apparently on our trail. At breakfast, I tried to bring it up to the others, each of us sitting around the table with heavy eyes and a tense silence. Our usual easy conversation had disintegrated into nervous glances and guarded tones. Chris was tapping his spoon against the table, his eyes darting around as if the walls themselves might be hiding our tormentor. "I think it's him, Ben," I finally said, watching their faces carefully. Jade looked at me sharply, her face paling as she put down her coffee. "No way. Are you serious? We haven't seen or heard from him in years. But he's been at every single stop." "It's not a coincidence, Jade," I insisted. "He's following us." I remember now, all those times we made fun of him, the names we called him. He just wanted to fit in, and we were terrible to him. Eva shifted uncomfortably, her eyes dropping to her hands. "But, I mean, it was high school. Kids are awful sometimes. It wasn't that serious, right?" "Not to us," I said, the words heavy with the weight of my realization. "But we don't know what he went through after we last saw him. People like that don't just vanish, they remember." A heavy silence settled over the table, each of us absorbing the possibility, feeling the guilt turn like a knife in our stomachs. The carefree fun of our trip had evaporated, leaving behind only the cold dread of what lay ahead. Despite our growing anxiety, we packed up and hit the road again, the mood somber and tense. We had planned to stop at a secluded hiking trail, somewhere quiet and scenic to unwind, to forget the unsettling encounters of the last 2 days. But as we pulled up to the trailhead, something felt off. The air was thick, pressing down on us with an unnatural silence. Even the usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves seemed stilled, like the forest itself was holding its breath. As we got out of the car, Eva glanced around, her face pale. "Are we sure this is a good idea? I feel like he's here. Watching." Chris tried to laugh it off, but his voice shook. "Look, we're just getting paranoid. Let's do the hike, take our minds off all this nonsense." But as we started down the trail, the unease only grew. Every step felt heavy, echoing in the silent forest as we made our way deeper into the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, like eyes were following our every movement from the shadows. And that's when I saw it, a faint scrap of paper tucked between the branches of a low-hanging tree just off the path. I pulled it down, my heart thumping as I read the words scrawled in thick, uneven handwriting. "You think I forgot?" I showed the note to the others, their faces going white as they read it. Tom tried to laugh, a hollow, nervous sound. This has to be a prank, right? Some freak coincidence?" But I could see the fear in his eyes, the doubt that mirrored my own. We were miles from the nearest town, in a place so remote no one could have left this note unless they were following us. "This isn't a coincidence," Jade whispered, clutching her arms tightly. "This is him, Ben. He's been here, waiting for us. We need to go back. Now." We turned to leave, but the path seemed to have changed somehow. Where we'd walked in on a straightforward trail, the way back seemed twisted, narrow, and overgrown. No one spoke as we stumbled forward, each of us glancing over our shoulders, expecting to see him lurking just out of sight. More notes appeared along the way, each one bearing the same eerie, confrontational tone. "You think I don't remember? You laughed at me. You'll feel how I felt." With every new message, the terror in our group grew. We began snapping at each other, our nerves fraying as we stumbled through the trees, the trail winding on forever as though leading us deeper into a trap. Eva's eyes were wide, darting around as if she expected him to leap out at any moment. Chris kept muttering under his breath, cursing the situation, cursing the past, cursing Ben. Why didn't we just apologize? Jade whispered, clutching my arm. Maybe he'd have let it go. It was too late for that. Whatever we'd done in high school, whatever pain we'd caused, had festered into something dark and inescapable. It wasn't just anger we were dealing with, it was years of resentment, simmering, growing, until it had become something monstrous. As we continued down the trail, strange sounds began to echo around us. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching leaves just behind us, though each time we spun around, we saw nothing. Shadows seemed to shift and dance between the trees, flickering just at the edge of our vision, but when we looked directly, there was nothing there. Just the overwhelming sense of being followed, hunted. We stumbled onto a small clearing, breathing heavily, our panic rising. I scanned the area, hoping to see some sign of the trail back to the car, but the trees seemed to close in around us, forming an impenetrable wall. Then we saw him. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, half hidden in shadow, watching us with that same, piercing stare. He hadn't changed much since high school, but there was a darkness in his face, an anger that radiated toward us, burning through the air. Jade let out a strangled scream, and we all backed away, huddling together as though somehow being close would protect us. "Ben," I managed to whisper, though my voice shook. He didn't respond, just took a slow, deliberate step toward us, his eyes never leaving mine. I could see a flicker of pain in his gaze, the kind of raw, unfiltered hurt that words couldn't convey. And I realized, with a sickening certainty, that he hadn't come here for forgiveness. "You think you can run?" His voice was low, barely more than a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a knife. "You think you can just forget?" The weight of his words sank in, and I knew that this wasn't just about the things we'd said or the laughs we'd shared at his expense. It was about the way we'd erased him from our lives, as though he'd never existed. He'd become invisible to us, a ghost lingering at the edges of our memories, left behind and forgotten. And now he'd come back to make sure we remembered. Panic set in. Tom bolted toward the trees, his voice cracking as he shouted for us to run. We scattered, each of us fleeing in a different direction, the forest swallowing us as we stumbled and tripped over roots and rocks. But no matter how fast I ran, the feeling of being pursued only grew stronger. His voice seemed to echo all around me, whispering words that tore through my mind, dragging up memories I'd long buried, moments I dismissed as harmless fun but that had scarred him deeply. Asterisk, you think you can hide? I see you, asterisk. The forest became a maze, twisting and turning, leading me in circles. I could hear the others shouting, their voices growing more distant as we scattered in blind terror. The shadows grew darker, pressing in around me, and with every step, I felt myself being pulled deeper into his world, a world filled with pain, anger, and the relentless need for revenge. This was more than a nightmare. It was a reckoning, one we couldn't escape, one that would force us to confront the past we tried to forget. And as I ran, the reality of what we'd done, what I'd done, settled over me, crushing any hope of escape. Ben wasn't just following us. He was dragging us back into the darkness he'd lived in for so long, and now that he'd found us, there would be no escape. We stood at the edge of the clearing, the abandoned cabin looming in the distance like a rotting memory. The trees around us seemed to bend inwards, pressing us closer together, as if nature itself was drawing us toward this moment. My chest felt tight, my heart thudding erratically, as though it knew what was about to happen but couldn't stop it. There was no turning back now. The others were silent, but I could feel the weight of their fear hanging heavily in the air. Chris kept wiping his sweaty palms on his jeans, Eva's eyes darted around, and Jade's face had gone pale, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped her backpack. We had spent days running, avoiding the inevitable, but now we had no choice. We had to face him. Ben. The name echoed in my head, thick with regret and fear. I tried to steady my breath, but every step we took toward the cabin felt like we were walking through wet cement. Each footfall seemed to echo louder, each one sinking us deeper into the dread we had tried to ignore all this time. The cabin was run down, its once white walls now peeling and cracked, the roof sagging under years of neglect. It had been abandoned for a long time, but it looked as though someone had been staying there. A faint trail of footprints led from the door into the dense woods, like a path drawn by some unseen hand, guiding us to our destination. There was a rustle from within, a shadow moving behind the grimy windows. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry as I turned to face the others. Are we really doing this? I asked, though I already knew the answer. No turning back now, Jade said, her voice low but firm. We approached slowly, the silence between us feeling heavier with each step. Finally, we reached the door. It creaked open on its own as we drew near, and there, standing in the doorway, was Ben. But he wasn't the boy we had tormented all those years ago. This man standing before us was a stranger. His face was gaunt, too thin, stretched tight over sharp cheekbones, his skin sickly pale under the dim light. His eyes, though, were the same, dark, unblinking, hollow. It was as if the life that had once been in them had been drained away, leaving only cold, endless emptiness. For a long moment, none of us spoke. We just stood there, frozen in place, staring at him. The weight of all the years, all the cruelty, all the memories of our high school days hung heavy between us, thickening the air. I could feel my stomach twisting into knots, the guilt clawing at me, gnawing at my insides. Ben didn't smile. He didn't move. He just stood there, his eyes never leaving ours. "You think I've forgotten?" His voice was low, raspy, like it hadn't been used in a long time. His words cut through the silence like a blade. "You think I just moved on? After everything you did?" I flinched, the words hitting me like physical blows. My mind raced, flashing through memories I tried to bury, endless moments of teasing, pushing, isolating him. He had been the target of our jokes, the one we'd singled out, the one we'd laughed at until our sides ached. I remembered the times we had forced him into lockers, made cruel comments about his clothes, his awkwardness, his differences. How many times had we left him out of things just for fun? How many times had we laughed when he cried? I remember it all, Ben continued, his voice steady now, colder than ever. Every name, every sneer. Every time you made me feel like nothing. Every time you looked at me like I was less than human. My chest constricted, my throat closing as I tried to breathe, but the air felt thin, suffocating. I wanted to apologize, to say something, anything, to make it right. But no words came. I felt small, powerless, in front of the person I had helped destroy. "We thought we were just kids," Chris muttered, his voice hoarse. He looked down at the ground, unwilling to meet Ben's gaze. "We didn't mean to. We didn't know. We didn't." "Stop," Ben interrupted, his voice sharp and cutting. "Don't you dare try to excuse it. Don't you dare pretend that it wasn't intentional. Don't you dare make it sound like you didn't know exactly what you were doing." His words hit harder than anything I could have imagined. There was no excuse. We knew what we were doing. We knew, and we did it anyway. Every joke, every sneer, every moment of ridicule, we had watched him crumble under it, and we had enjoyed it. "Do you know what it's like to be invisible?" Ben whispered, stepping forward, his eyes darkening. "To walk through every day, feeling like you're nothing, like you don't matter, like you're a shadow? To feel like you'll never belong, no matter what you do? I felt like that every single day because of you." I took a step back, feeling the weight of his words pressing down on me. Ben's anger was raw, real, and it burned through me like acid. I could see the pain, the years of torment, and I couldn't deny that we had been the ones to put him in that place. But something was wrong. Something in the air was shifting, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Ben wasn't just angry, he was enjoying this. The way his lips twitched into something like a grin, the way his eyes glinted with a kind of satisfaction that made my skin crawl. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It wasn't just about making us feel guilty. It was about power. About control. "I've been planning this," Ben said, his voice suddenly smooth, almost too calm. "You think I just showed up out of nowhere? You think this is a coincidence? No. This has been years in the making. Every step, every moment, every memory of you, every one of you, has been part of the plan. The plan to make you feel what I felt. To make you suffer like I did. A chill ran down my spine. The way he said it, like he had orchestrated this entire encounter from the very beginning, made my stomach turn. How long had he been watching us? How long had he been planning this moment, savoring the thought of our fear? You think you've changed, Ben continued, his voice getting louder, more confident. But deep down, you're the same people who made my life hell. The same people who laughed and mocked and threw me away like I was nothing. Each word felt like a hammer, pounding against my chest, breaking apart the fragile walls I had tried to build between myself and the guilt. But his face, his eyes, there was something almost gleeful about it. He wasn't just angry. He was enjoying this. Chris spoke up, his voice cracking. Ben, what do you want from us? What do you want us to do? Ben tilted his head, his smile widening, but it wasn't a smile of forgiveness. It was the grin of a predator, of someone who had the power to tear us apart and loved the feeling. I don't want you to do anything. I just want you to understand what it feels like to be forgotten, to be made invisible. I want you to understand the consequences of your cruelty. And if that means you suffer a little, then so be it. His eyes glinted as he took another step forward. And now, I get to enjoy watching you break. Watching you unravel. The air around us thickened, the weight of his words pressing down harder. I felt the first stirrings of panic deep in my chest. The room seemed to close in on us, the walls narrowing, the shadows lengthening. The guilt, the fear, the anger, it all swirled together into something dark and suffocating. We had thought we could escape. We had thought we could outrun our past, but there was no running now. Ben wasn't just punishing us. He was relishing every second of our fear, every second of our realization that we had brought this upon ourselves. And that realization, more than anything else, made my blood run cold. We tried to run, tried to escape, but it felt like we were moving through water, the weight of our fear slowing us down with every step. Our breaths were ragged, our feet stumbling over the uneven ground, as if the forest itself was conspiring against us. Behind us, Ben's voice echoed through the trees, growing fainter, then louder again, as though he were circling, playing with us. We can't outrun this, Jade gasped, her voice barely above a whisper, as she stumbled beside me, her eyes wild with panic. I didn't have time to respond. We reached the car, or what was left of it, and the sight of it made my stomach drop. The once functional vehicle, our escape route, now seemed like a relic, something from a forgotten world. The tires were slashed, the engine had bent at a strange angle, and the side mirrors shattered. We had been sabotaged. There was no way we could drive out of here. I turned to the others, my heart pounding in my chest. It's done. We're trapped. Ben's laughter rang out from somewhere nearby, sending a cold shiver down my spine. It was low at first, a murmur in the distance, then louder, more mocking, until it was right behind us. Did you really think I'd let you leave? His voice sounded almost playful, like he was enjoying every moment of our terror. I spun around, my fists clenched in anger and desperation. You've had your revenge, Ben. What more do you want? He stepped out from the shadows, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. He looked almost amused, as though our fear was a game to him. The twisted grin on his face made me want to puke. I've told you, he said softly, his voice like a venomous whisper, this isn't about revenge anymore. This is about teaching you something you'll never forget. Something that'll stay with you until the day you die. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. He wasn't just out to punish us. He wanted to break us. To destroy us from the inside out. You think you've been running from me this whole time? Ben's voice was like ice as he stepped closer, his eyes never leaving mine. No. You've been running from yourselves. Running from the people you really are. The people you used to be. Images flooded my mind, each memory more vivid and painful than the last. Our laughter, our cruel words, the way we had torn him apart with every joke, every snide remark. My hands shook as I gripped the side of the car for support, the memories overwhelming. I saw Ben in the hallways of our high school, head down, eyes hidden behind thick glasses, his body hunched in shame. I saw him sitting alone at lunch, the taunts and insults thrown his way as we passed by, as if he didn't even deserve to be noticed. We made him invisible. Stop, Chris gasped, his voice breaking. We didn't mean it. We were just stupid kids. We didn't know what we were doing. Ben laughed, and the sound cut through the air like a blade. That's what you always say. You didn't know. But you did. You knew. Every time you picked on me, every time you made me feel small, you knew exactly what you were doing. You just didn't care. I could see Chris' face crumpling, the guilt overwhelming him, his hands shaking as he tried to avoid Ben's piercing gaze. We're sorry, Ben, he whispered, his voice raw. We were terrible. We know that now. But please, please, just let us go. We won't do it again. Ben tilted his head, his smile widening. You think you've changed? You think you've learned your lesson? You're still the same people who tortured me. Deep down, you're still the same. You haven't even begun to reckon with what you did. I closed my eyes, trying to push the weight of it all away. I didn't want to confront it. I didn't want to face the monster we had been, the monsters we still were. But Ben was right. We hadn't really changed. Not deep down. Not where it mattered. Enough. Jade screamed, her voice trembling with rage. We get it. We were awful to you. But this isn't fair. This isn't what you deserve. For a moment, Ben's expression shifted, almost imperceptibly, as though her words had cracked something in him. His smile faltered for just a second, but then he stepped forward again, his eyes gleaming with a cold, pitiless light. This isn't about fairness, he said, his voice steady, almost calm now. This is about making you understand that there are consequences. You hurt me, you ruined my life, and now it's your turn to suffer. But that's not enough for me. He paused, and the eerie silence between us stretched to an unbearable length. You want to know the real reason I've been doing this? I nodded, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't know what I expected, but it wasn't what came next. I've been waiting for you to come to terms with what you did, he said quietly. But more than that, I've been waiting for you to understand something else. His eyes glittered with something dark and triumphant. You can't escape it. You can't ever escape it, not from me, and not from yourselves. You think you can leave it all behind? That you can move forward, that you've changed? No. You've been running from the truth for years, but it will always catch up to you. I'll make sure of it. The air felt like it was suffocating me, closing in tighter with each word. The realization hit me hard. Ben wasn't going to let us go. No matter how much we begged, no matter how sorry we were, he was never going to stop. He was going to keep following us, haunting us, until we broke, until we were forced to face who we really were. And worst of all, he wasn't alone in this. He'd grown in our absence, grown stronger, more dangerous. He had become the monster we had created. And that thought was worse than anything else. That he was right. We couldn't escape. I turned to the others, their faces pale, their eyes wide with terror, but I knew it was already too late. There was no escaping this nightmare. Ben wasn't just here for revenge, he was here to teach us a lesson. A lesson we would never forget. But as we stood there, frozen in place, one last thought crept into my mind. What if this wasn't the end? What if Ben's nightmare was only just beginning?